They called him a fool for buying a broken horse, but what that horse did next made an entire town fall silent. Under the burning Texas sun, a young ranch hand walked into an auction where hope was sold cheap and mercy didn't exist. When everyone laughed at the crippled black horse left to die, he stepped forward with his last dollar and a look that said he saw something they didn't. That moment changed not just his life, but the heart of a whole town. The sun hung over the Texas hills like a molten coin, beating down on a crowd that smelled of dust, sweat, and horsehair. At the county fairgrounds, men in faded hats leaned against the rails, spitting tobacco and trading jokes about which horse would fetch the highest bid. The air shimmered with heat and indifference, except for one young man standing apart near the fence. Luke Carter, 23, had the kind of silence that made people uneasy. His denim shirt was bleached pale by the sun, his jeans frayed at the knees, his boots cracked from long seasons of ranch work. In his pocket rested a crumpled envelope, all the savings from 2 years of cleaning stalls and fixing fences, the money he had meant for tuition at a horse training school he would never attend. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, slick and confident. "Next up, lot number 17, a black stallion, Spanish bloodline, injured hind leg, sold as is." The handlers pulled the horse into the ring. Dust rose around his hooves, glowing gold in the sunlight. Storm. That's what they called him once, though no one in the crowd remembered. His coat, once a gleaming midnight, was now dull with neglect. He limped heavily, the muscle above his left hock trembling with each step. Murmurs spread, worthless, crippled, better off shot. Laughter rippled like dry grass. Luke felt the laughter like a nail driven between his ribs. The horse's eyes, dark, alert, proud even in pain, caught his for the briefest moment. In that gaze, Luke saw a mirror, a creature broken not by weakness, but by being pushed too hard, too young. The auctioneer shrugged. "Starting bid, 500. Silence. The heat pressed down. A fly buzzed near the microphone. 400. Anyone? Storm shifted, the limp more pronounced now. Someone in the crowd chuckled. He's good for glue, not much else. Luke's fingers tightened around the envelope in his pocket. He heard his father's voice, a memory carried by the wind. "Son, a horse doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs a reason to believe again." The auctioneer sighed. 200, last call. Luke raised his hand. The crowd turned. A few snickers, a whistle, then that slow wave of disbelief. "Sold, to the young man in the back," the auctioneer announced, half amused, half pitying. When Luke stepped into the ring to take the reins, Storm jerked violently, nostrils flaring. The rope burned Luke's palm, though horse's strength was still there, wild, defensive, humiliated. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured, though his own heartbeat was thundering in his ears. The horse's eye rolled toward him, and for a second Luke thought he saw a flicker of something other than fear. Outside, the crowd dispersed, the laughter fading behind him. The fairground quieted, leaving only the buzzing of cicadas and the far-off hum of engines heading home. Luke stood beside the horse trailer he'd borrowed from a neighbor, staring at the stallion who refused to look back. The animal stood rigid, nostrils trembling with distrust. Sweat glistened on its flank like small coins of glass. "You don't owe me anything," Luke said softly. "But you're not done yet." He opened the trailer gate and waited. Storm hesitated, ears flicking, eyes uncertain, Then, with a grunt, he limped forward, a single step, then another, until he stood inside. The door clanged shut. Luke leaned his forehead against the metal, his hand still on the latch. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, or maybe it was just his heart beating too hard in the silence. As he climbed into his old pickup truck, he caught sight of the horizon, a faint shimmer where heat met sky. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself a thin, cautious smile. Behind him, in the trailer, storm shifted and blew through his nose. A short, sharp sound, half fear, half defiance. The road ahead stretched empty and endless, ribboning through the hills toward home. Luke turned the key. The engine coughed to life, and as the truck pulled away from the fairgrounds, the last light of day caught the dust rising behind them. A trail of gold fading into dusk. He didn't know then that this broken animal would change everything, not just his luck, not just his future, but the way he understood hope itself. The road to the Carter Ranch stretched through the Texas backcountry, a long thread of cracked asphalt lined with dry grass and cedar trees. By the time Luke arrived, the sun had sunk behind the hills, painting everything in copper and violet. The air smelled of dust and diesel. In the trailer, storm kicked once, twice. Sharp thuds that echoed like heartbeats in a hollow chest. Luke parked beside the old barn, its roof rusted and sagging, and climbed down slowly, every movement deliberate, like approaching something sacred. He unlatched the trailer door. Storm stood frozen, head low, ears flat, his breath clouding in the cooling air. The horse refused to move. Luke didn't pull or coax. He just stood there, letting silence stretch between them. After a long minute, Storm shifted, testing the earth beneath his injured leg. When he finally stepped down, the boards creaked but held. The sound was soft, almost a sigh, and for Luke, it felt like the first page of something he couldn't yet name. Inside the barn, the light was dim and warm. Dust floated through the air, like tiny ghosts, caught in the beam of a single lantern. Luke tied Storm loosely in a corner stall, laid down fresh hay, and poured water into an old tin bucket. Storm didn't drink. He stared past Luke, eyes fixed on nothing. A horse that didn't trust was like a man who had stopped praying. Alive, but not really living. Luke stayed there for hours, sitting on an overturned feed bucket, watching the animal breathe. Every few minutes, Storm flinched at small noises, a moth hitting the lamp, the creak of wood. Luke said nothing. Sometimes healing started with silence. When his mother, Ellen, came to the barn, she didn't scold him for bringing home another mouth to feed. She just stood by the door, her voice quiet but firm. "That horse won't thank you for your pity, Luke. They never do." Luke nodded, eyes still on Storm. "I didn't buy him to be thanked." Ellen studied her son's face, then turned away. "You have too much of your father in you," she murmured. It wasn't a compliment or an insult, just the truth. That night, after his mother went inside, Luke pulled an old tin box from his coat pocket. Inside were 3 letters, yellowed and creased, written in his father's rough handwriting. He unfolded one and began to read aloud, his voice low, like he was telling a secret to the dark. "A horse won't follow strength, son. It follows calm. Don't make it obey you. Make it believe you." The words filled the quiet barn. Storm's ears twitched toward the sound. Luke smiled faintly and kept reading, his tone steady, each sentence carrying the weight of memory. The horse turned his head, nostrils flaring, as if testing the scent of something long lost, gentleness. Around midnight, Luke doused the lantern and left the stall door half open. The night outside was cool, and the stars hung low over the ridge like silver nails. From his small cabin window, he could still hear Storm shifting in the straw, restless but not panicked. That was enough for one night. Days passed, marked not by the calendar, but by routine. Morning chores, feeding, mending fences. Every day, Luke came to the barn, leaning against the gate, speaking softly. Sometimes he read aloud from his father's letters. Sometimes he just hummed old country songs he remembered from childhood. The keywords for horse training, equine therapy, and ranch life would have drawn clicks online. But here, they meant something real. The rhythm of work, patience, and repetition. Storm learned his voice first. When Luke spoke, the horse's breathing slowed. But the distance between them stayed, the invisible space made of fear and memory. Luke didn't rush it. "We'll get there," he whispered one afternoon, setting a bucket of water near the stall. "When you're ready." That evening, thunder rumbled beyond the hills, the kind that promised a storm, but never delivered. Luke watched the clouds bruise the horizon while Storm stood under the barn's eaves, unmoving, his black coat shining wet in the faint drizzle. A streak of lightning lit his eyes, still guarded, but no longer hollow. Something was changing, slow and quiet, like soil softening before rain. Late that night, Luke was startled awake by a noise, hooves scraping wood. He ran to the barn barefoot, heart pounding. Storm was pacing in his stall, head tossing, eyes wild. A tarp flapping loose had frightened him. Luke reached out instinctively, speaking low, steady, his voice the same tone his father once used to calm skittish cattle. "Easy, boy. It's just the wind. You're safe." Storm hesitated. For a moment, Luke thought the horse would lash out. Instead, Storm stopped, sides heaving, and let Luke step closer than ever before. They stood there, both breathing hard, the storm outside echoing the one between them. Luke lifted a trembling hand, slow as sunrise, and laid it against the horse's neck. Warm, solid, real. Storm didn't move. He just stood there, eyes half closed, the muscles in his body easing under the touch. Luke felt the world narrow to the space between his hand and that heartbeat beneath the hide, the quiet proof that trust wasn't given. It was earned. When morning came, the sky was washed clean, the air smelling of rain and new beginnings. Ellen found her son asleep against the stall gate, Storm standing beside him like a silent sentinel. She didn't wake him. Instead, she smiled, small, private, and fleeting, and went back to the house. Inside the barn, a beam of light broke through the roof's cracks, falling across Luke's shoulder and the horse's dark mane. Dust sparkled in the air, floating like blessings no one asked for. Luke stirred, opened his eyes, and saw Storm watching him. Still wary, but closer now. "Morning," he said softly. "Let's try again." And the horse, for the first time, didn't turn away. The morning came slow and golden, stretching across the hills like a sigh. Luke stood outside the barn, sipping coffee that had gone cold, watching Storm graze inside the corral. The horse still favored his left hind leg, but he no longer trembled when the wind rattled the tin roof. That was progress, not enough to boast about, but enough to breathe a little easier. A pickup truck rumbled up the dirt road, kicking up a trail of pale dust. Luke squinted as it stopped near the gate. A woman stepped out, tall, calm, dressed in jeans and a sun-bleached shirt. Her hair was tied back, her boots clean but worn at the heels. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, the kind used by veterinarians. "Morning," she said, her tone even and unhurried. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, county vet." Luke wiped his hands on his jeans. "Didn't call for a vet." She smiled faintly. "Your mother did. Said her son brought home a wounded miracle and refuses to let anyone touch it." He frowned, half embarrassed. "He's not a miracle, just stubborn." "Then you two will get along fine," she replied. Sarah's voice carried that soft authority that people either trusted or feared. Storm lifted his head at the sound, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring. The horse's body stiffened as she approached the corral. Luke stepped between them automatically, his instinct sharper than his manners. "Easy," she said, not to him, but to the horse. "I won't hurt him." Her eyes met Storm's. Calm, unblinking. She didn't reach out or move closer. She just stood there, breathing slow, letting the silence stretch until the animal's muscles eased. Then she nodded toward the injury. "Old tendon tear. Looks like he was worked too hard after it happened." Luke glanced at her, surprised. "You can tell that from here?" Sarah crouched, her gaze never leaving the horse. "I've seen it before. In rodeo stock, racing studs. People push because winning pays more than healing does." She rose again, dusting off her jeans. "You've got a long road ahead, Luke Carter. But he can come back, not the way he was, but enough to live without pain." Luke hesitated. "How?" She looked at him then, really looked. "By making him trust you more than he remembers the man who broke him." The words landed heavier than she probably meant them to. Luke nodded, throat tight. Sarah gave him a sheet of handwritten instructions. Stretches, compress routines, gentle walks at dawn. "And talk to him," she added. "Horses don't understand words, but they remember tone. Make yours worth remembering." That night, Luke followed her advice. Storm stood under the barn light, eyes half closed, his body still scarred, but calm. Luke read from his father's letters again, voice low, steady. It didn't matter what he said. What mattered was that he stayed. When the horse leaned forward, exhaling softly, Luke could almost feel his father's hand on his shoulder, the quiet approval of a man long gone. Days folded into one another, marked by repetition and quiet work. Sarah returned every few days, sometimes to check the leg, sometimes just to watch. She never rushed the animal, never raised her voice. She taught Luke how to wrap the tendon with even pressure, how to spot small changes in posture, how to read fear before it turned to panic. Her presence filled the barn with something Luke hadn't realized was missing: steadiness. In one of those afternoons, when the sky turned the color of rust and the smell of hay filled the air, Sarah leaned against the gate, watching Luke brush Storm's mane. "You've got patience," she said. "Most people your age don't." Luke chuckled softly. "Most people my age aren't trying to heal what they can't afford to lose." Sarah smiled, but didn't answer. For a moment, the barn was all sound, the scrape of hooves, the slow rhythm of breathing, the whisper of wind slipping through cracks in the walls. As the sun dipped low, Luke noticed Storm's gait improving. The limp remained, but each step seemed less burdened. He turned to Sarah, pride flickering across his face. "He's getting better," she studied the horse, then him. "So are you." He frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Wounds don't just happen to bodies, Luke. Sometimes they live in how you look at things." Her words lingered after she left, like the scent of her cologne. Faint, warm, and impossible to forget. That night, Luke sat outside the barn, back against the wooden post, watching fireflies flicker in the tall grass. Inside, Storm stood quietly in his stall, no longer pacing, no longer flinching at every sound. Luke realized he hadn't felt that hollow ache in his chest all day. He looked up at the stars. "You were right, Dad," he whispered. "Calm first, then trust." Behind him, Storm snorted softly, as if answering. Luke smiled, his eyes heavy with the kind of tiredness that came from hope, not defeat. When the wind shifted, carrying the scent of cedar and rain, the horse lowered his head and took a slow step closer to the gate. The smallest motion, but enough. Luke didn't move. He just sat there, letting the moment unfold. The cicadas sang, the night wrapped around them, and somewhere far off, thunder grumbled over the hills. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, not sure to whom, maybe to himself, maybe to the horse. "Tomorrow we start walking again." And from inside the barn came a single sound, a hoof striking the earth once, firm and sure, like an answer. By late summer, the fields around the Carter Ranch had turned the color of old copper. Grass crunched underfoot, and the sky seemed wider than ever. Storm's leg had strengthened enough for short walks beyond the fence line, his gait uneven but proud. Luke guided him slowly down the dirt path, the reins loose, his voice low and steady. "Easy, boy. We're not racing anyone." Storm flicked an ear toward him, accepting the rhythm of those quiet mornings. It was peace of a sort, the kind that arrives when you stop waiting for life to go right. Until the past came back wearing polished boots and a smile that never reached the eyes. The first sign was a white truck parked by the gate. Luke knew the emblem before he saw the man. Hargrove Ranch, painted in gold letters. His stomach tightened. The driver's door opened, and Ethan Hargrove stepped out like he owned the sun. Tall, clean-shaven, wrapped in money and self-assurance, he looked out of place against the weathered fences and dust. "Well," Ethan said, taking off his sunglasses, "didn't think I'd find my horse still standing." Luke froze, Storm snorting beside him, the air thick with tension. "Your horse? You sold him at auction." Ethan shrugged, smiling thinly. "Sold, yes. But you see, Storm's still branded with the Hargrove mark. That makes him part of the family legacy." Luke's jaw tightened. "That mark doesn't mean he's yours anymore. It means he survived you." For a moment, silence cut through the dry wind. Then Ethan's laugh, sharp and hollow. "Cute, but you'll learn something about this part of Texas, kid. Everything and everyone answers to money." Sarah appeared from the barn just then, wiping her hands on a towel, eyes narrowing when she recognized the man. "Ethan?" "Dr. Mitchell," he greeted smoothly. "Still trying to save lost causes?" Sarah crossed her arms. "Sometimes the lost ones are worth saving." He stepped closer, ignoring her, his gaze fixed on Luke. I'm making you an offer. 10,000 for the horse. Cash. Luke's throat felt dry. He's not for sale. 15. You're wasting your breath. Ethan's eyes cooled. You don't want to make this personal, Carter. You've got debts. That land of yours isn't exactly bank-proof. Luke didn't answer. The insult didn't sting as much as the truth behind it. His mother's medical bills, the unpaid mortgage, they were cracks beneath every quiet morning. Sarah stepped forward, voice firm. That's enough, Ethan. Leave. He smiled again, but this time it was all teeth. You'll regret this. I always finish what I start. Then he turned, the dust from his boots settling like ash after a small fire. When he drove off, the world felt too still. Luke stood there, the faint smell of gasoline lingering in the air, watching the trail disappear into the horizon. Who was he? His mother asked that evening when Luke told her what had happened. Ellen Carter had the calm of someone who had already seen too many storms in her life, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. The man who broke Storm, Luke said quietly. And he's not done yet. She looked at him, tired eyes meeting his. Then you'd better be ready. That night, Luke couldn't sleep. He sat outside the barn, watching the stars blink above the dark outline of the hills. Storm shifted inside the stall, restless, sensing his unease. Luke whispered into the night, "He's not taking you back. Not while I'm breathing." The next few days carried a strange electricity. Sarah came by more often, helping Luke strengthen Storm's leg, teaching him new stretches, new patience. Yet there was an unspoken worry between them now. The shadow of Ethan Hargrove, the man who didn't like being told no. One afternoon, while Luke was repairing a section of fence, Sarah joined him. The heat shimmered over the fields, the air heavy with cicadas. "He'll come back," she said, her tone low but certain. Luke didn't look up. "Let him. I'm not afraid. You should be careful. People like him don't lose quietly." He paused, hammer in hand. "Then we don't give him the chance to win." That evening, a storm rolled across the plains. The real kind this time. Wind howled through the barn slats. Rain drummed on the tin roof, and lightning split the sky. Luke ran out to secure the doors, but Storm, terrified of thunder, fought against his halter, eyes wide. "Hey, easy," Luke called, stepping inside. "It's just rain." But Storm's panic grew. The horse reared, hooves striking the wall. Luke moved fast, ducking low, murmuring calm words over the thunder. Slowly, painfully, the animal stilled. Luke's hand brushed along Storm's neck, the same place his father once told him trust begins, between heartbeat and breath. When the storm outside finally broke into drizzle, the barn was filled with that warm, damp quiet that follows chaos. Luke exhaled, forehead resting against the horse's shoulder. "We'll be fine, boy. Let them come." A flash of headlights cut through the rain outside. A truck idled briefly near the road, then turned away. Luke didn't see it, but Sarah did from her porch across the valley. She watched the taillights disappear, her heart tightening with the certainty that Ethan Hargrove hadn't left this story behind. The next morning, Luke found a note pinned to the fence post, the handwriting sharp and deliberate. "You think you can keep what's mine? Watch how fast I take everything else." He read it once, twice, then tore it in half. The pieces fluttered into the dry grass like burned paper. He didn't show it to Sarah or his mother. Instead, he walked to the barn, and found Storm waiting, calm and silent. Luke placed a hand on the horse's muzzle. "Guess the past doesn't die easy," he said softly. "But neither do we." Storm exhaled through his nose, a low, steady sound that felt like a promise. And as the sun rose over the Texas hills, Luke understood something his father had tried to teach long ago. Some battles aren't about winning. They're about not backing down, no matter who's watching. The night had been too quiet, the kind of stillness that doesn't rest, only waits. The air over the Texas hills was thick and dry, the smell of dust mixing with the faint sweetness of hay. Luke had fallen asleep on the couch, his boots still on, exhaustion finally catching up to him. In the barn, Storm shifted restlessly, the low snorts of an uneasy dream drifting into the silence. Then came the crack. A single, sharp pop, like wood splitting. Luke stirred. The second sound came quicker, angrier, a rush of air, a soft whoosh, and then the unmistakable roar of flames. He was on his feet before he could think, heart slamming against his ribs. When he threw open the door, the sky beyond the window glowed red. "Mom!" he shouted, already running toward the barn. The fire had started near the far wall, hay and oil cans ignited in a sudden, hungry blaze. The flames licked upward, bright as sunrise, devouring wood, paint, everything they touched. Storm screamed, a high-pitched, terrified cry that cut through Luke like a blade. "Hold on!" he yelled, pulling his shirt over his mouth. Smoke rolled out in black waves, blinding him. He shoved the barn door open, heat slamming into him like a solid wall. The horse reared inside, rope twisted, eyes wide with panic. Luke could feel the fire's breath on his neck, hot and merciless. He tried to untie the halter, fingers slipping on the rope, his lungs burning. "Easy, boy, easy. Stay with me." The air was thick enough to choke on, and the flames crawled closer, sparks biting at his skin. For a moment he thought they'd both die there, trapped in that small world of fire and fear. Then a voice behind him. His mother shouting, "Luke, get out!" And another, Sarah's, rough from running. "The back door, Luke! Use the back!" He turned, spotted the smaller exit near the tack room. He slashed the rope with his pocket knife, grabbed Storm's mane, and pulled. The horse hesitated, muscles quivering, then lunged forward. They stumbled through smoke and heat, out into the open air. Storm staggered, coughing, patches of soot across his flank. Luke collapsed beside him, gasping. The world blurred, red, black, and gold. Sarah and Ellen ran toward them, blankets in hand, smothering the embers clinging to their clothes. The barn behind them roared louder, a monster fully awake. They could only watch as the roof gave way, sparks flying into the night sky like dying stars. The barn that had been Luke's world, his sanctuary, his father's last gift, was gone within minutes. The smell of smoke and burning pine would stay in his skin for days. When the firefighters finally arrived, there was nothing left to save. The ground hissed and steamed under their boots. One of them, a man Luke knew from town, put a hand on his shoulder. "Lucky you got him out," he said, nodding toward Storm. "Another minute, and you'd both be gone." Luke couldn't answer. His throat hurt from the smoke, but it wasn't the fire that made it hard to breathe. It was the emptiness, the space where everything used to be. Later, when the sirens faded and the neighbors went home, Luke sat in the dirt, staring at the smoldering wreckage. Storm stood nearby, trembling but alive, his dark coat streaked with ash. Sarah crouched beside him, gently running her hands down the horse's legs. "Minor burns," she said softly. "Nothing deep. You both got lucky." Luke laughed once, short, hollow. "Lucky, right." She didn't argue. Instead, she handed him a damp cloth, and together they wiped the soot from Storm's face. The horse's breathing slowed, his body leaning subtly toward Luke's touch, as if the weight of fear could only be carried together. By dawn, the fire was nothing but smoke, curling into a pale sky. Ellen stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red but dry. She looked at her son. Exhausted, shirt torn, arms streaked with soot, and the horse beside him. "What now?" she asked. Luke didn't look up. "We rebuild." "With what money?" He didn't answer because he didn't know. But when Storm pressed his muzzle against his shoulder, Luke managed a faint smile. "We start with him," he said. "That's enough." Neighbors came later that morning. Some brought tools, others coffee, others just the kind of silence that means, "We saw and we care." One of them, old Mr. Harris, handed Luke a hammer. "You can use my shed till you get back on your feet," he said. "Don't let that fancy Hargrove boy think he can scare you off." Luke froze. "You heard?" "Son, everybody's heard. That man's been trouble since he learned how to talk." Sarah watched the exchange, her jaw tightening. She stepped close enough for only Luke to hear. "Ethan didn't just want to buy the horse," she said. "He wanted to break you. This fire, but it wasn't chance." Luke's fists clenched around the hammer. "Then he'll see what it's like when something doesn't break." That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Luke led Storm to the edge of the field. The grass shimmered red in the dying light. The horse limped, but followed without hesitation. They stopped at the fence line, the only part of the barn that had survived untouched. Luke ran a hand through Storm's mane. "We're not done," he whispered. "You hear me? They can burn the barn, but they can't burn what's left in here." He pressed a hand to the horse's chest, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat under the scarred skin. Storm lifted his head, ears forward, eyes glinting with that old fire, the one Ethan tried to crush. Luke smiled through the exhaustion, his voice barely more than breath. "Good. We'll need that." Behind them, smoke still rose from the ruins, curling into the twilight like a prayer that refused to fade. When the first stars appeared, Sarah walked up quietly. "You'll need help rebuilding," she said. Luke nodded. "I know. You'll have it," she said simply. They stood together in silence, the night cooling around them, the smell of ash still thick in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, long and mournful. Storm shifted beside them, pressing closer, as if to remind them all that even the burned ground could hold life again. Luke looked toward the horizon, the faint shimmer of dawn just beginning, and spoke not to Sarah, not even to himself, but to whatever mercy still lingered in the world. "Tomorrow we start again." And in that fragile promise, beneath the ruined roof of a night that should have broken him, something new began to breathe. The smell of smoke clung to everything, his clothes, the soil, even the morning air. For days after the fire, Luke woke to the faint crackle of phantom embers in his dreams. Each dawn began the same. He'd walk to where the barn once stood, kneel in the blackened dirt, and sift through ashes with calloused hands. Nails, hinges, the curve of a melted horseshoe. small remains of what was once his life's heartbeat. But the world, stubborn as ever, kept moving. The sun rose, the fields turned from ash gray to the pale gold of September, and the neighbors started coming. They didn't say much. They just arrived with hammers, shovels, and thermoses of coffee. Old Harris brought spare lumber from his shed. The lanes from the next ranch offered hay and feed. Even the mailman stopped by, not to deliver anything, but to help haul debris. Luke had never liked owing people, yet now every nail hammered into the new frame of the barn carried something deeper. Not charity, but faith. Faith that even after a blaze, something could grow again. Sarah came every afternoon. Her truck would rumble up the dusty road, and Storm would prick his ears before the engine even stopped. She brought ointments for the horse's burns, rolls of clean bandages, and her quiet presence. They worked mostly in silence. Sarah would kneel beside Storm, her hands gentle but firm, cleaning each wound with practiced care. Luke would hold the halter, murmuring low when the horse flinched. The smell of antiseptic mingled with hay and sweat. "You ever think about leaving?" Sarah asked one day, wrapping fresh gauze around the horse's leg. "Where to?" Luke replied. "Anywhere with less fire." He smiled faintly. "Storm wouldn't like it. He's got Texas in his bones." She glanced up, meeting his eyes. "You sure it's not you who does?" Luke didn't answer. The truth was complicated. This land, scarred, dry, unpredictable, mirrored everything inside him. To leave it would feel like walking away from the only part of himself that still made sense. By the end of the week, the skeleton of a new barn stood proud against the horizon. It wasn't fancy. It leaned a little and smelled of fresh pine. But when the last plank went up, the neighbors clapped, and for the first time since the fire, Ellen Carter smiled. That night, as they ate a modest dinner under the porch light, Luke noticed his mother's hands trembling slightly as she lifted her cup. "You should rest, Ma," he said gently. "I will," she answered, staring into the dark yard. "But promise me something." "Anything." "Promise me you won't let that man take more from you than he already has." Luke hesitated. "He's not getting a thing from me." "Then don't let hate be what's left." He wanted to tell her hate wasn't what kept him going. It was something quieter, sharper. The need to prove that pain didn't get to decide the ending. Later, he found himself at the corral again. Storm was standing under the moonlight, coat gleaming silver where it wasn't singed. Luke ran a hand down his neck, feeling the rise of healed scars beneath the hair. "Still standing," he whispered. "Guess we both are." Over the next weeks, Sarah intensified their routine. She introduced hydrotherapy, hauling a large metal trough to the barn, filling it with cold, water hauled by buckets. Storm eyed it suspiciously, ears flicking. "It'll help him rebuild muscle without straining the tendon," Sarah explained, "like therapy for athletes." Luke laughed softly. "Didn't think we were running a spa out here." "You'd be surprised how much good water can do," she said, rolling up her sleeves. The sessions became ritual. Luke guided Storm into the trough while Sarah stood nearby, stopwatch in hand, timing the steps, the shifts of balance. The horse's reflection rippled across the surface, distorted but beautiful. Each day the limp grew less pronounced. One afternoon, after the therapy session, Sarah leaned against the fence, eyes soft with quiet pride. "You've got something special with him, Luke. That connection. It's rare." He shrugged. "Just time and patience." "No," she said, It's more than that. Some people make animals obey. You make them trust. There's a difference. Luke looked at her, not sure what to say. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and for a moment everything, the ashes, the anger, the sleepless nights, felt smaller, almost bearable. But peace never stayed long. A few days later, Ellen received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The Carter land deed, stamped with a foreclosure notice. Luke read it twice before realizing what it meant. Ethan had bought the loan from the bank. He stood on the porch, hands shaking, the evening sun bleeding orange over the hills. Sarah came by just as he finished explaining. "He's trying to force you out," she said, her voice steady, but her jaw tight. Luke nodded. "Guess he doesn't like losing. You can fight this. Legally." "With what money?" He tossed the letter onto the table, frustration spilling through the cracks of his calm. He's already taken enough. But he won't take this ranch. Not while I can still lift a hammer. Sarah reached for his arm. "Then let me help." He looked at her, exhaustion and gratitude mixed in his eyes. "You already are." That night, Luke didn't sleep. He went to the barn, lit a small lantern, and sat beside Storm. The horse shifted closer, warm breath brushing his shoulder. The flame flickered over the new wood beams, fresh and pale against the dark. "Everything's temporary," Luke murmured. "Even pain. Even men like him." He looked at his hands, cracked and scarred, then at Storm's healed leg. "But what we build, maybe that lasts." Storm nickered softly, pressing his muzzle against Luke's chest, a simple gesture that felt like understanding. Outside, the night air hummed with crickets, and the scent of cedar hung thick. From the hills came the faint glow of a distant house, the Hargrove estate, golden and proud. Luke stared toward it, not with hatred, but with a cold, steady promise. He whispered, "You can try to burn everything I have, Ethan, but you'll never touch what made me start again." The lantern's light trembled, but didn't go out. When dawn came, the world was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows pain and decides to begin again anyway. The first cool winds of autumn swept through the valley, carrying the scent of cedar and the faint promise of rain. The fields had turned brittle again, and the grass rattled like dry paper when the breeze passed. Luke Carter stood at the edge of the rebuilt barn, watching the horizon fade into a soft gold haze. Storm grazed nearby, his coat sleek again, the limp barely noticeable unless you looked too closely. It should have been a season for peace, but peace doesn't last long when pride is involved. The sound of an engine echoed down the dirt road. Luke didn't turn. He already knew who it was. Ethan Hargrove's silver truck came into view, gleaming like a knife under the sun. It stopped by the gate, the dust swirling around its tires before settling on the faded grass. Ethan stepped out, his boots spotless, his shirt ironed, his confidence the same as ever. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the new barn. "Nice work for a man one bad month away from losing everything." Luke's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Hargrove?" Ethan pulled a folded document from his jacket and waved it lazily. "Official notice. I now own your mortgage. I thought you might prefer to hear it from me instead of the county." Sarah, who had been brushing Storm in the corral, froze. She walked over, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You bought his debt? That's not business, Ethan. That's cruelty." Ethan smiled, slow and deliberate. "Business is what you call it when you're on the winning side. Don't mistake my generosity, Doctor. I'm offering him a way out. Sell me the horse and the land goes free." Luke stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. You think you can buy everything, don't you? Not everything, Ethan replied. Just what matters. Storm lifted his head at the rising tension, snorting softly. The air between the two men stretched thin, heavy with years of unspoken anger. One raised in privilege, the other in dirt and sweat. Sarah's voice cut through the silence. Ethan, leave. Ethan turned toward her, smile still painted in place. You always had a soft spot for lost causes, Sarah. Guess you finally found one that can't be saved. Get off my property, Luke said, the words low but sharp. Ethan's expression hardened, the charm slipping. You really think you can fight me? I've got judges, bankers, friends in every corner of this county. You've got a barn held together by hope and rust. Luke took another step forward until they stood nearly chest to chest. Hope's stronger than you think. For a second, neither moved. Then Ethan laughed, a brittle, hollow sound, and slid his sunglasses back on. I'll give you a week, he said, turning toward his truck. After that, this place is mine. He drove off, leaving behind a trail of dust and the sour smell of diesel. Sarah watched the truck disappear, her hands shaking. He won't stop. I know, Luke said quietly. That's why I can't, either. That evening, the sun dipped low over the hills, staining everything in red and amber. Luke worked in silence, mending the corral fence. Each strike of the hammer felt like a heartbeat, steady and defiant. Storm stayed close, following him from post to post. Sometimes Luke thought the horse understood more than any human ever could. Sarah joined him later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. They sat on the fence, watching the sky fade to indigo. You can't fight money with stubbornness, she said. I'm not fighting with stubbornness. Then what are you fighting with? He stared at the horizon. With what my father left me. Sarah frowned slightly. The ranch? No, his pride. The night grew colder. In the distance, coyotes cried. Sarah looked at him, her face soft in the dim light. Pride can build you up, Luke, but it can also burn you down. He met her gaze. Maybe, but at least it's fire, I understand. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached out, resting her hand briefly on his arm, the kind of touch that said more than comfort, less than confession. Then she stood, brushing the dust from her jeans. You'll need proof if you want to keep this land. There has to be something illegal in how he got the mortgage. I'll ask around. Sarah, I'm not asking, she interrupted gently. Let me help. Luke nodded. Just be careful. When she left, the night settled heavy again. Luke leaned on the fence, staring at Storm under the pale light. The horse shifted closer, his breath visible in the cooling air. Guess we're both too proud for our own good, Luke murmured. But maybe that's the only reason we're still standing. The days that followed moved slow and sharp. Luke threw himself into work, repairing tools, hauling feed, training Storm. Every morning, he led the horse down the trails, testing the healed leg over uneven ground. Storm's strength returned, each stride more confident than the last. One afternoon, Luke guided him into a slow trot, the sun glinting off the horse's coat. Storm's muscles rippled with effort, his hooves beating steady rhythm on the packed earth. At the edge of the pasture, Luke stopped, eyes damp with pride. You still got it, boy, he said. You never lost it. Storm tossed his head, a low nicker rumbling in his throat. proud, almost playful. That evening, a truck approached again. But it wasn't Ethan this time. It was a man in a dark suit carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as a county assessor. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I'm here to evaluate the property before the bank proceeds with foreclosure." Luke's stomach turned cold. "You mean, before Hargrove proceeds?" The man hesitated, but didn't deny it. "You've got until the end of the month to settle your balance, or vacate." When he left, the air seemed to thicken. Luke stood on the porch until the truck disappeared down the road. Inside the house, his mother pretended not to cry. That night, Luke walked out to the pasture and sat in the dirt beside Storm. The horse lowered his head, breathing slow, steady. Luke leaned against him, closing his eyes. "I can't lose this," he whispered. "Not you. Not this place. He already took too much." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain from the south. Somewhere in the dark, lightning flickered, distant, harmless for now. Luke reached up and laid a hand on Storm's neck, feeling the warmth of life beneath his palm. "We'll find a way," he said softly, "even if we have to build it from nothing." Storm snorted once, as if answering, then lifted his head toward the horizon. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow and cold, dotting the dust around them. Luke didn't move. He sat there, letting the rain wash the soot and worry from his hands until the earth smelled like itself again, raw and clean. In that quiet, between thunder and breath, he made himself a promise. He would not let Ethan Hargrove own the ending to their story. The morning of the county rodeo arrived with a sky washed clean by rain, the fields shining with dew. The banners stretched across the entrance to the fairgrounds flapped gently in the wind, painted in red and blue. Hill County Annual Rodeo and Livestock Fair. Trucks rolled in one after another, hauling trailers full of sleek, muscled horses, each animal glistening with oil and polish. Luke's old pickup looked out of place in that parade of shine and swagger. The paint had faded, the muffler coughed smoke, and the trailer he pulled creaked at every turn. But inside stood Storm. Strong again, the scars along his flank silver in the morning light. His eyes were clear, calm, and watchful. Sarah leaned against the passenger door, sipping coffee. "You sure about this?" Luke nodded, adjusting his hat. "He's ready." "Maybe," she said. "But are you?" He didn't answer, just smiled faintly. "Guess we'll find out." At the fairgrounds, the world was loud and alive, children laughing, country music spilling from loudspeakers, the smell of fried dough and leather mixing in the air. The clatter of hooves echoed from every direction. Luke led Storm out of the trailer, earning curious glances. Compared to the pristine show horses, Storm looked older, rougher, his gait imperfect. But when he lifted his head, there was something regal in the way he carried himself. The quiet authority of a creature that had walked through fire and lived. They checked in for the rehabilitation showcase, a new event meant to honor trainers who'd restored injured horses. It wasn't about speed or performance. It was about trust, recovery, the bond between man and animal. The winner would take home $10,000 and the respect of every rancher in the county. As Luke signed the papers, a voice drawled behind him. "Didn't think I'd see you here, Carter." Ethan Hargrove stood a few feet away, dressed in a crisp white shirt and polished boots. His horse, a chestnut stallion named Valor, stood beside him. Tall, flawless, every muscle gleaming like bronze. "This is an event for success stories," Ethan added with a smirk. "Not pity projects." Luke didn't rise to the bait. "We'll let the judges decide what success looks like." Ethan's smile sharpened. "Don't worry. They will." Sarah stepped between them before words could turn to something worse. "Come on, Luke," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." The day moved slowly toward noon. Contestants warmed up in separate arenas, the clinking of bits and the soft murmur of trainers filling the air. Luke guided Storm through stretches, gentle trots, never pushing too hard. The crowd drifted closer, some out of curiosity, others out of disbelief that the Carter boy and his crippled horse were still trying. At the announcer's booth, the loudspeaker crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Rehabilitation Showcase. Today we celebrate the spirit of recovery and the unbreakable bond between rider and horse." One by one, participants entered the ring. Horses stepped carefully through obstacle courses, some still favoring old injuries, others already close to whole. Applause came and went in polite bursts. Then Ethan and Valor entered. The chestnut stallion moved like liquid sunlight, each step a display of power. Ethan tipped his hat to the crowd, smiling for cameras. His routine was flawless, rehearsed, dazzling. The judges nodded approvingly. When he exited, the cheers rolled through the stands like thunder. Then came Luke's turn. He took a deep breath, looked at Sarah, who gave a small nod, and led Storm into the arena. The noise dimmed. People leaned forward, unsure what to expect. Luke didn't rush. He began with a slow walk, guiding Storm through the course's first gates. The horse's stride was uneven, yes, but steady. Each time his hoof struck dirt, you could feel the weight of 1,000 quiet mornings, the patience, the healing, the persistence. Halfway through, Luke stopped and removed the rope halter. A murmur swept through the crowd. He stepped back, hands open. Storm stood motionless for a heartbeat, then, as if understanding, began to move again on his own. He circled the arena without command, following the pattern they had practiced countless times. Luke walked beside him, not leading, only accompanying. The crowd fell silent. At the final obstacle, a narrow ramp, Storm hesitated. Luke whispered, "It's okay. We've done harder things." The horse snorted, pawed the dirt, then climbed. His gait faltered, at the top, but he didn't stop. When he descended the other side, the applause was hesitant at first, then grew, spreading like fire. Sarah, watching from the gate, felt tears sting her eyes. It wasn't a performance, it was a confession of trust, forgiveness, survival. Luke approached the judges, tipping his hat, then turned back to Storm and laid a hand on the horse's neck. "You did good, partner," he murmured. Storm pressed his muzzle against Luke's shoulder, and for a moment the world felt still. Ethan's voice cut through the air. "A nice sympathy act," he said loudly enough for the nearest spectators to hear. "But this is a competition, not a charity show." The words drew a few uneasy laughs, but most people ignored him. The judges whispered among themselves, pens moving over their papers. Then, suddenly, commotion. From the corner of the arena, Valor reared, kicking at the gate, panic flashing in his eyes. Ethan tried to steady him, yanking the reins hard. The stallion squealed, twisting violently. The crowd gasped. Sarah ran forward. "Let him go, Ethan! He's spooked!" But Ethan pulled tighter, shouting, "I said whoa!" Valor jerked sideways, the bit cutting his mouth. He reared again, throwing Ethan backward into the dirt. The horse bolted across the arena, narrowly missing the fence. The judges rushed to help, and silence fell over the stands. When Ethan staggered up, covered in dust, his perfect image shattered. His glare could have cut glass. The announcer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll resume shortly." Luke stayed quiet, stroking Storm's mane. He didn't look at Ethan, didn't gloat. The moment didn't need words. When the results came an hour later, the crowd gathered near the podium. The third-place ribbon went to a local rancher, second to a rescue foundation. And first, the announcer paused, letting the suspense draw, to Mr. Luke Carter and Storm, for extraordinary demonstration of trust and rehabilitation. Cheers erupted. Luke stood frozen for a beat, disbelief flickering across his face. Then he smiled, a quiet, genuine smile, and stepped forward to accept the ribbon. Sarah clapped until her hands hurt. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. His truck had already left the parking lot. As the crowd dispersed, Luke knelt beside Storm, looping the ribbon gently around the horse's neck. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "You showed them what winning really looks like." Storm flicked his ears and blew softly, as if in agreement. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, scattering gold light across the fairgrounds. It landed on the two of them, man and horse, scarred but whole. For the first time in years, Luke didn't feel like he was fighting the world. He was simply standing in it, proud, alive, and free. Night fell gently over Hill County, the last of the rodeo lights glowing like distant stars across the valley. The fairgrounds were almost empty now, only the echo of laughter and the rustle of paper cups carried on the wind. Luke stood by Storm's trailer, the blue ribbon still looped loosely around the horse's neck. The applause had faded, but the sound lingered somewhere deep inside him, soft and unreal. He ran his fingers through Storm's mane, still dusted with the dirt of the arena. "Guess we did all right," he said quietly. The horse nickered, pressing his nose against Luke's shoulder as if to answer. Sarah approached from behind, her jacket draped over her arm. "You more than did all right," she said. "You reminded everyone what these shows are supposed to be about." Luke smiled. "About winning?" "About grace," she replied, "and second chances." They loaded the tack into the truck, the air cooling fast as the wind shifted from the north. Luke could smell the coming rain again. Or maybe he imagined it, the way people smell change before it happens. By the time they pulled back onto the highway, the fairgrounds had dissolved behind them, swallowed by darkness. The road home stretched long and straight, headlights cutting through the fields. Neither spoke for a while. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with things neither dared say aloud. Halfway back, Sarah broke the silence. "Ethan won't let this go." Luke kept his eyes on the road. "He's had enough of a beating for one day." "You humiliated him," she said softly. "People like him don't forgive that." Luke's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Then I'll be ready when he tries again." Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of admiration and worry. "Luke, you don't have to fight every battle alone." He didn't respond. Some truths, he thought, were better left hanging in the air like smoke, visible, impossible to hold. When they reached the ranch, Ellen was waiting on the porch, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the lantern. Storm whinnied softly when he saw her, and she smiled, a rare, proud smile. "That horse of yours," she said, as Luke stepped out. "He's got the kind of heart this world forgets to look for." Luke laughed softly. "So do you, Ma." She waved him off. "Go get some sleep. Tomorrow'll be another day full of work." But sleep didn't come easy. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the shutters, whispering against the barn's new boards. Luke lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the ribbon still hanging on the hook near the window. He could almost hear his father's voice again. "A horse doesn't need perfection, son. Just someone who won't give up when it stumbles." Outside, Storm shifted restlessly. Luke slipped out of bed and went to the barn. The night air was cold, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The horse stood quietly, head low, eyes half closed. Luke ran his hand along the animal's neck, feeling the familiar rise and fall of breath. "We did. Good," he murmured. "But it's not over." The next morning, Sarah arrived early. Her face was drawn, serious. "You need to see this." She handed Luke a folded newspaper from the county's daily. On the front page was a photograph. Ethan, standing beside the county commissioner, shaking hands under the headline, "Hargrove Estate to sponsor equine charity program." Luke read the article in silence. The event, scheduled in 2 weeks, would feature a showcase honoring the region's finest rehabilitation work, conveniently hosted at the Hargrove Ranch. Sarah's tone hardened. "He's turning your work into his story." Luke folded the paper slowly. "Then maybe it's time people saw who really did the work. You can't confront him alone." "I don't plan to," Luke said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. Later that afternoon, as he led Storm into the pasture, the sound of a truck climbing the gravel road reached them. He turned, expecting Sarah, but it wasn't her. Ethan's foreman, a thick-set man with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, leaned out of the window. "Message from Mr. Hargrove," he said. "He wants to make a deal. One last chance to walk away before things get complicated." Luke's jaw tightened. "Tell him I don't take orders from thieves." The man grinned, flicked his cigarette to the ground, and drove off. That evening, clouds rolled in heavy and gray. The smell of rain deepened. Sarah came by after her rounds, carrying files she'd pulled from the courthouse, documents proving Ethan's purchase of the Carter mortgage wasn't entirely clean. "We can use this," she said, "if you're willing to fight it the hard way." Luke studied the papers, the columns of fine print blurring together. "He's built his life on loopholes. I'd rather beat him in daylight than in paperwork." Sarah sighed. "Luke," but before she could finish, a sudden noise cut through the night, the unmistakable crack of wood splintering. Storm neighed sharply. Luke ran outside. A section of the corral fence lay smashed, tire tracks gouging the earth beside it. He knelt, fingers tracing the mud. Fresh. Whoever had done it hadn't been gone long. Sarah caught up behind him, breath quick. "Was he inside?" "No," Luke said, standing. "He's safe." The anger in his chest was sharp, steady. "This is his warning shot." Sarah shook her head. "Then we warn back, by surviving." For the next several days, Luke worked in silence. He rebuilt the fence by hand, post by post. He could feel eyes on him from across the fields, Ethan's men maybe, watching, waiting. But he didn't stop. Storm followed him everywhere, calm and resolute, as if the horse understood that every nail Luke drove into the wood was a promise, that they weren't going anywhere. On the 7th evening, the sky opened up, pouring rain that hammered the tin roof and turned the ground to mud. Luke stood in the downpour, head tipped back, letting the water soak through his shirt. When he turned toward the barn, Storm was standing in the doorway, silent and steady, a shadow cut from the night itself. Sarah's truck appeared through the rain. She jumped out, shouting over the noise. "I talked to the county fair board. They want you and Storm to perform at the next regional showcase. It's bigger, televised, sponsored by the state. If you win there, Luke, the prize money could clear your debt and end this for good." Luke blinked water from his eyes, half laughing. "You serious?" She nodded, hair plastered to her face. "Dead serious, but it's in 10 days. You'll need to push him harder than ever." He looked toward Storm, who snorted, pawing the ground impatiently. Luke smiled. "Guess he's ready." Lightning streaked across the horizon, illuminating the soaked fields in a sudden flash of white. Storm didn't flinch. Luke took that as a sign. He turned back to Sarah, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Then let's show them what second chances really look like." The thunder answered, deep, rolling, almost like applause. The week before the regional showcase felt like a prayer said under one breath. Mornings began with frost glazing the grass, the light thin and silver, the kind that makes every sound sharper. Luke rose before dawn, brewed coffee that tasted like stubbornness, and walked to the barn where Storm waited. Ears pricked, eyes bright in the lamplight. They worked without spectacle. Poles on the ground, slow circles, transitions that depended less on muscle than on trust. When the horse hesitated, Luke stood still and let silence do the teaching. When he advanced, Luke moved beside him, not ahead. You could feel the miles they had walked together even when they stood still. Sarah kept the schedule strict, her handwriting pinned to the barn wall next to a ribbon that no longer felt like a miracle, only a milestone. She swapped out bandages, iced the tendon after every session, and adjusted the regimen with a precision that bordered on devotion. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with Ellen, circling numbers on a legal pad, mortgage figures, veterinary care receipts, even estimates for home insurance now that the new barn stood. "If you win, the prize isn't just money," she told Luke. "It's time. Time to breathe. Time to heal without calculating interest." Ellen listened quietly, running her fingers along the paper as if the numbers might soften under touch. 3 days out, the Hargrove truck idled at the far end of the road, silhouettes motionless behind tinted glass. Luke didn't look up from the pasture. He set another pole, measured another distance, and asked Storm for a trot so slow it felt like a long exhale. "Don't stare at them," Sarah murmured. "Make them stare at this." The horse rounded his neck and floated, the limp almost gone, not hidden but transformed into rhythm, like a scar you choose to call a story. On the last evening before they left, Luke opened the tin box of letters and read the shortest one, the one he had nearly worn through at the folds. "A good horse won't carry your pride, son. It'll carry your truth. If you can't give it that, ride alone." He folded the page, slipped it into his pocket, and walked out under a sky so clean it looked new. Storm followed him to the fence line and stopped at the place where Ash had once been. They stood there a while, two shadows of the same promise. The regional showcase was held at a fairground big enough to make Luke's county look like a practice ring. Flags thudded against their poles in a stiff wind. Vendors lined the walkways, saddles shining, leather oiled, brochures for equine therapy programs printed on glossy stock. A radio voice somewhere discussed mortgage rates and relief options for family farms, the kind of word string that might have felt like sales once. Today, it sounded like the language of survival. Luke parked in the far lot and unloaded Storm, who stepped down without a flinch, nostrils drinking in the new air. Backstage, trainers clicked their tongues and compared bloodlines. A few recognized Luke and nodded with that half-smile ranch country keeps for men who have earned the right to be here. Sarah handled the paperwork and disappeared briefly to meet a reporter who'd called about a story on rehab horses and rural healthcare costs. When she returned, her eyes were bright. "They'll run it either way," she said. "Win or lose." Ethan was impossible to miss even before you saw him. You sensed him, the heat of a man who thinks the world is a mirror. He stood near the in-gate in a tailored jacket, valor beside him like living brass. "You brought your rescue project to a real arena," he said, almost pleased. "Good. I like a public ending." Luke looked past him to the course, a series of lines and turns that required balance more than speed, courage more than show. "Some endings aren't yours to write," he answered, and he meant it in the plain way a man means a fence is a fence. The opening ceremony glittered the way big events do. Announcer's voice too loud, music just a shade too triumphant. Families filled the stands, kids with cotton candy, older couples who had driven in from 2 counties away, veterans in caps with patches arranged like quiet medals. Ellen sat high up near the rail with a plaid blanket over her knees. When Luke looked up, she lifted 2 fingers the way his father used to. "I'm here." "Go on." Competitors went in one by one, and the wind knocked applause into tatters. Valor and Ethan were near the end. Luke and Storm at the very last slot. A blessing disguised as pressure. Sarah checked the wraps once more, her palm flat on Storm's shoulder blade, feeling that dependable thrum beneath hair and skin. "No heroics," she said. "No proving. Just tell the truth." Luke nodded. He knows his lines better than I do. Valor entered to a cable news buzz. Cameras pivoting, light balanced on chrome. The stallion worked like a machine cut from muscle, every transition precise, every turn measured to the inch. Ethan smiled to the grandstand, and the grandstand smiled back. At the final salute, applause rose easy, automatic, the response trained into people when something looks expensive and moves like lightning. Then the gate swung for Luke. He took off the halter before he stepped across the threshold. No rope, no bit, only breath and body. A murmur spread like a small wind. He walked to the center and stood beside Storm, and they both did nothing for a heartbeat long enough to reset the room. The announcer started to speak, then mercifully didn't. Luke lifted his hand, not as cue, but as greeting, and began the pattern. Walk. A pause so soft it felt like forgiveness. Trot, collected into something round and careful, as if they were carrying water and didn't want to spill a single drop. When they changed direction, Luke moved as if he had remembered a dance he learned in another life. At the ramp, Storm hesitated the way the hurt remember. Luke whispered. No word, just the sound of a man who lived through fire, and the horse went on, one step, then the next, until they crested the top and breathed together. Near the rail, a girl in a wheelchair watched with both hands clasped at her chest, her eyes the exact bright of a sky after rain. Luke saw her. Storm did too. He turned the circle in their direction and stopped within the hush of her breath. "May I?" Luke asked her mother, who nodded through tears she had no time to wipe away. Luke lowered himself first, let the girl touch the horse's neck, then slid an arm under her and helped her lean across Storm's withers. For a moment she was not seated or pushed or braced. She was simply held up by a creature that has carried our history longer than our remembering. The stadium did not erupt. It did not need to. The sound was a deep, human quiet, the kind that mends before it celebrates. When they finished, Luke placed his palm over Storm's chest, his own chest lifting to meet it. 2 heartbeats in a brief, private chorus. He saluted the judges with a tilt of his hat and walked out the way he had come in, unarmed, but not unready. The deliberation took a long time, perhaps because judges argue hardest when something simple asks to be named. Ethan smiled his courtroom smile at a camera crew. Luke drank water and read one more line from the letter in his pocket, just to feel his father standing somewhere in the shade. Sarah didn't speak. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, in that stubborn kind of nearness people offer when prayer is the only tool left. The announcer returned with the voice of a man about to step on a wire. Third place went to a foundation that rescued racehorses. Applause. Second, to a ranch that pioneered a new program. Applause. A wind stroke of silence, and then, first place for exemplary demonstration of humane rehabilitation and rider-horse communication. Luke Carter and Storm. The sound wasn't loud. It was deep. Ellen covered her mouth. Sarah's hand found Luke's, pressed once. There. Luke didn't raise his arms or shout. He rested his forehead against Storm's and smiled into the dark silk of the horse's mane. And that was enough. Ethan walked over later, the reporter at his shoulder having drifted. Stories, like water, follow gravity. "Enjoy your ribbon," he said, voice polite enough to cut. "You won't enjoy the bill when your mortgage comes due." Luke met his eyes, steady as a fence post. "The prize money goes to the bank today, and the county's looking at how you acquired that note." He glanced to Sarah, who didn't bother to hide the folder tucked under her arm. "Legal aid took the case when they saw your signature on 3 pages where it didn't belong." It wasn't a threat. It was the plain reading of a document. By dusk, the check was in a teller's hands. The receipt felt like something holy. Ellen folded it and slipped it into the Bible she kept by the stove. A call came an hour later, an investigator asking about collusion between a lender and the Hargrove estate. There would be hearings, delays, the slow river of accountability, but the land, their land, was safe. Mortgage relief didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like the ache leaving a body. Weeks turned to the kind of autumn Texas gets if it's lucky. Clear, blue, honest. Luke built the last stall of the new barn and hung a hand-painted sign. Raymond Ranch, Equine Therapy and Community Rides. No slogans. No promises big enough to break. Just the name of a man who taught a boy the difference between pride and truth. Veterans came on Saturdays. Kids from town came after school. A local personal injury lawyer donated helmets. The feed store gave a discount without using the word charity. Storm learned the slow, particular patience required to carry someone who shakes when they try to hope. On a late afternoon that looked exactly like forgiveness, Luke found Sarah at the fence line, her hair caught in the wind like a flag that had decided to be soft. "You staying?" he asked, as if the question weren't a door. She smiled. I'm already here." They didn't name anything after that. They just watched Storm move across the pasture with that saved grace, each step an answer to a question nobody asked out loud. Evenings closed with simple things: Ellen humming while she shelled beans, the radio talking about small-town grants and farm insurance updates, coyotes stitching the hills with their thread of sound. Luke walked to the far post where the old barn had burned, knelt, and laid his palm on the earth. It no longer smelled like smoke. It smelled like dirt and wind, and the kind of quiet you earn. He looked up. The horizon wore its usual gold. Storm lifted his head and came, the way the faithful do. Luke reached out, and when their shadows touched, he felt the line from auction to ash to arena draw tight and sing. Not triumph, not revenge. Something gentler that endures longer. The ordinary courage of staying. "Come on," he said, turning toward home. Storm fell in beside him, easy as breath. Behind them, the sun set without fanfare, because some victories don't care to be seen. They prefer to be lived, morning by morning, hand by hand, step by honest step, until one day you look up and realize the horizon isn't far anymore. It's where you're standing. If this story touched your heart, tell me what you felt down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because next week I'll share another true story about how hope can rise from the unlikeliest places. Stay with me, and let's keep these stories alive together.